Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video, we're going to be continuing the read-along of the Secret Zoo Riddles in Danger by Brian Schick. And last time we finished off, we completed chapter 13, so we'll be starting with chapter 14 today. And as always, if there's any pictures, I'll be showing you them, but please feel free to follow along. Chapter 14, Back into the Grottoes. Later that day, their thoughts still on the incident with White Walt, the scouts reported to the Clarksville Zoo for cross-training. They met Tank outside the Forest of Flight, where the big man stood with his arms crossed, his head gleaming. Tank turned and led them into a building. Inside, the air was thick with the earthy fragrance of grass, soil, and tree bark. A giant glass dome seemed to hover above a space filled with leafy branches and free-flying birds. The Forest of Flight was like a tiny jungle. As Tank led the scouts down the visitor path, Richie said, "Shouldn't the exhibit be closed for this?" "Nope," Tank said. "You gotta learn how to do this in the middle of the day." They followed the path to a clearing where a family of 4 was staring up into the trees. They stopped along a rail and stared out, pretending to be interested in a rainbow-colored macaw perched on a branch. Noah realized how Tank loomed over Richie like a giant, his dark skin in stark contrast to Richie's pale color. "Are we supposed to be keeping a low profile?" Noah whispered. "Because you guys aren't looking too much like father and son." Tank chuckled and clapped Richie on his back, sending his pom-pom into a dance. Richie bumped against the rail and then reached up to correct his glasses. After a few minutes, the family walked off around a corner and soon left the building. Tank glanced over his shoulders to make certain no one else was around. A loud voice suddenly came in front of them. "Whack! Tank! Secret Zoo! Whack!" It had to be the macaw. Now it was staring down at the crossers, repeatedly tipping its head in new ways. "You nuts, bird?" Tank said. The macaw turned away and stared off into the distance, seeming slightly ashamed. Shaking his head, Tank pointed into the exhibit. "See that tree? There's a big hollow in the trunk of the other side. It goes down to the grottos. All you gotta do is run out there and climb into it as fast as you can." "But what about the other people?" Richie asked. Tank looked around. "What other people?" "There's no one here right now, but someone could walk in at any minute." "Just be quick, and you won't have nothing to worry about." "But—" "Megan," Tank said, "show my boy Richie how it's done." Megan smiled at the invitation and quickly slipped through the railing. She ran forward, startling birds into the air. Seconds later, she ducked behind the tree and was gone. "See that?" Tank said. "Nothing to it." "Maybe not for Megan," Richie said, "but she's like an empress of adventure. Me, I sort of trip on air." Tank gently pulled down on Richie's shoulder, directing him between the rails. "Well, just make sure you trip into the right hole then." Richie squirmed with the steel bars and then tore across the exhibit, the bright decals on his running shoes twinkling. He lost his balance, staggered a few feet, then ducked behind a tree and was gone. Ella went next. To Noah, Tank said, "You're last, bub." Noah shimmied through the railing and ran behind the tree. When he ducked into the hollow, he saw a dark passage dropping down about 15 feet. A series of steps were built into one wall. He took them and landed in an adjoining tunnel with stone walls and an arched ceiling. The Grottoes. Tank fell in behind him, and the group gathered together. "That was too easy," Ella said. "It sometimes can be that way," Tank said. Feathers of all sizes and colors surrounded their feet. Tank flattened them into the ground as they headed down the grotto, saying, "Come on, gang." The scouts chased after him. Birds swarmed from around a corner and flew up into the Forest of Flight. As Tank passed the portals, he called off their names: the Secret Metropolis, Koala Crossings, the Secret Alata Hippopotami. He led the scouts into a gateway marked Grottoes WSE, and Noah felt the magic move through his body. This new area of the grottos was much like the others. The difference was that the ceilings and walls were covered with small lizards. They were dotted and striped in patterns in ways that rivaled the designs in Richie's running shoes. Crawling all around, they created prismatic swirls of color. They were concentrated around a portal marked Amazing Geckos, a Clarksville Zoo exhibit where visitors made their way through a maze with gecko-covered walls. "Why aren't they in the secret zoo?" Megan asked. Tank shrugged. "No idea. They like it down here for some reason. A lot of animals do." As the scouts moved forward, a few geckos jumped down to their shoulders and crawled along their backs. One landed in Megan's hair, looking a bit like a bright blue bow. Another one landed on Tank's bald head and clung to a spot just above his ear. They crossed through a portal marked Grottoes NNE and walked past new gateways. The secret Caribou, Little Dogs of the Prairie, Pizzeria. Tank explained things as they went. When the gateways were built, why they were built, which ones were best to get to certain spots, which ones to avoid, which ones to plan on getting wet in, which ones might send you a miss. As they neared a gateway marked a fuss of walrus, a broad-whiskered snout of 2 ivory tusks poked out from the curtain. Out came a walrus, clumsily walking on its flippers. Halfway into the grottos, it stopped. The curtain draped over its body like a bedsheet. As the scouts walked past it, they patted its blubbery side. The scouts continued to explore for the next hour. They kept to the grottos and didn't venture into the exhibits or the sectors. Toward the end of their cross-training, Tank stopped to suddenly beside a portal that Richie walked straight into his backside. The big man crouched low and picked up a matted tuft of hair. It matched the one that they'd found near the knick-knack and snack shack. "Sasquatch," Noah said. Tank nodded, his big, bald head rocking up and down. He stared at a spot on the ground, then ran his finger along a curved impression in the dirt. "See this?" he asked, his voice brought down to a whisper. "This is the heel." The scouts squatted beside him. In front of the footprint was the indication of a second print. It showed how the Sasquatch had walked through a nearby gateway. From their crouched position, the curtain seemed to loom above them, a velvet curtain on any ancient stage. Noel felt a chill work across him. He suddenly realized how cold and quiet the tunnel was. Tank said, "You went that way, that's for sure." From the nearby curtain, something suddenly swung out, an arm with a mangy mess of hair. Curled claws sliced through the air, and a muscular hand seized Tank's arm. The big man was pulled off his feet and yanked through the portal. Noah moved to go after him and stopped him as the curtain was flung aside and 2 monstrous figures appeared. Sasquatches. They snarled, saliva gooping over their lips. Noah stepped back and stumbled over his friends, who were still crouched down. On all fours, he peered across the tunnel and spotted a gateway. He crawled to it, yelling, "Go! Go! Go!" On their hands and knees, the scouts did. A second before reaching the portal, Noah stared up to read the name of the place beyond it, the Secret Polliwog Bog. As the curtain stroked across his back, Noah realized the scouts had never been there. Chapter 15. The Secret Polliwog Bog. Just beyond the portal, Noah's palms pressed against something hard and flat and slick. Beneath him, the floor dropped a few inches and gave out in strange ways. Looking around, he realized that he'd crawled onto a stretch of lily pads across a dirty body of water, a bog or a swamp. The lily pads continued straight about 50 yards and stopped at a muddy shore. Not far into a wet, moss-covered woodlands, Noah saw a curtain dangling from a tree, the gateway into the city of species. Ella slammed against him and yelled, "Move! Move!" Noah sprang forward, almost like a frog, and took off crawling across the dense patch of lily pads. The floating leaves sank a few inches beneath his hands and knees, but were firm enough to keep him out of the water. His body dropped and shifted in odd, unexpected directions. The lily pads were covered with frogs, green and brown and speckled. Hundreds sprang in all directions, their twiggy legs dangling beneath their bodies. They landed on Noah's back and struck his head like rubbery pellets fired from a toy gun. He peered back at the other scouts. Like him, they were struggling to crawl across the shifting lily pads, and like him, they were quickly being covered with frogs. The curtain to the grottos flew to one side, and through the opening charged 2 Sasquatches. Their weight was too much for the lily pads, though, and the monsters plunged into the water, leaving behind a series of circular waves. Noah stopped. and the other scouts turned back to see what he saw. The Sasquatches were gone. The four friends kept perfectly still and stared out. No one dared to speak. Around them, waves lapped at the lily pads, and frogs continued to hop, but fog hung in the air, and winged bugs buzzed by dragonflies the size of hummingbirds. The distance played the rum-rum-rum sound of bullfrogs, constant and throaty. A Sasquatch rose in front of the curtain like a monster on the stage of a horror show. It stood still, water dripping from its fangs. A few lily pads clung to it, their stem wrapped in its stringy hair. It snorted up water, then locked its eyes on the scouts. It was blocking their way back to the grottos. The water was up to the monster's chest, which meant it was over the scouts' heads. Noah looked out in all directions. Their best escape was into the city of species through the portal on the shore. "Guys," Noah said. Just then, the other Sasquatch reached out from the water beside them and swung its arm down at Megan, barely missing her. "Go," Noah commanded. He tried to stand, but his legs plunged through the lily pads. Crawling was the only way. The scouts moved as fast as they could, their arms and legs pitching wildly beneath them. Frogs continued to leap all around, their panic an echo of the scouts. About 30 yards from the shore, the Sasquatch sprang up in front of Noah, who somersaulted into his back and kicked the soles of his shoes into his chest. The beast splashed backward and became entangled in the long stems of the lily pads. Noah rolled onto his stomach and saw the now distant portal back to the grottos. Just as Noah realized the other Sasquatch was gone, a furry hand punched through the lily pads just behind his friends and swung through the air. The second Sasquatch's claws barely missed Ella's head and sliced through a patch of frog-covered lily pads. "We're cornered!" Richie hollered. The Sasquatch behind Noah untangled itself and slid back into the water. The scouts swung their heads around, trying to locate their monstrous adversaries in the murky bog. There was no sign of them. "Which way?" Ella asked Noah. When he didn't respond, she barked, "Noah! Which portal?" Noah looked in front of them, behind them. He stared into the dark water over the edge of the lily pads. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Keep still," Megan whispered. "If we can get both of them to one side, we can run to the portal in the other direction." The scouts waited. No one moved, or breathed. Even the frogs were still. Noah wondered how long the Sasquatches could hold their breath. Ella reached over into Richie's jacket. "What?" "Shh," Ella said. "Watch this." When she withdrew her hand, she had Richie's penlight in it. She flicked on the switch and heaved it toward the portal to the grottos. It smacked down on the lily pads, 20 feet away, its light clouded by a puddle of water. "Get ready," Ella said. The scouts braced themselves, suddenly conscious of what Ella was trying to do. Both Sasquatches sprang up at the same time beside Richie's penlight and swiped down at it, splashing water and ripping away lily pads. The scouts turned and crawled as fast as they could in the opposite direction. "Go, go, go!" Ella screamed. Noah's heart pounded. The lily pads continued to swing out in differing directions, their flimsy stems collapsing. As the scouts closed to within 20 yards of the shore, Noah was suddenly hoisted into the air. Beneath him was a Sasquatch. The beast shoved out its arms, and Noah flew through the air, his limbs flailing, then splashed down about 40 feet away. As Noah sank, the world went pitch black, and his winter clothes filled with weight. Unable to touch the pond floor, he swam to the surface, gasping for air. On the now distant stretch of lily pads, his friends had stopped crawling and were staring out at him. "Keep going!" Noah yelled. He realized the water was churning. All around him, something was swimming, small, flexus bodies squirming along his arms and legs. They felt like tiny snakes. Beneath Noah and the lily pads, the Sasquatch stood, seaweed and muck clinging to its torso. It raised its arms, displaying the piercing points of its long claws, then roared and ran at him through the waist-deep water. Noah turned to the shore and swam, his arms swinging in wild arcs, his hands swatting through the things in the water. Waves spilled off his face and into his mouth. He understood nothing but to go, to go as fast as he could. Something clenched his ankle and pulled him back. His nostrils burned as water was forced into them. Peering over his shoulder, Noah saw the Sasquatch looming over him, its arms cocked. Just when he expected its claws to come down and tear into his body, the Sasquatch abruptly released his leg and took a frenzied step away, its arms swiping through the water. Noah peered into the dirty pond and realized what was happening. The tiny creatures were converging on the Sasquatch. 100 streamed past Noah. He saw their dark sinus shapes. The Sasquatch rolled its head left and right and turned its body in fitful jerks. The water swirled and splashed as the curvy creatures moved in on it. They began to wriggle up through its mangy hair, rising out of the water along its arms and torso. Noah saw they were 4 inches long, with tails and bulbous heads. Tadpoles. He saw at least 30, then 40, then many more. They squirmed up to the Sasquatch's arms and back and stomach. The confused beast swiped at its body, tearing out patches of fur. The tadpoles continued up its neck and over its head. Clutching its face, the Sasquatch staggered to one side, lost its balance, then toppled into the water. The pond churned violently as the swell of tadpoles plunged after their prey, traces of moonlight gleaming on their slick bodies. Noah didn't wait to see what was to become of the Sasquatch. He turned and swam. A minute later, he pulled himself onto the shore, muck oozing through his fingertips. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw the other scouts charging away from the lily pads. He merged into his friends, and together they headed for the gateway into the city of species. Noah glanced around. There was no sign of the second Sasquatch. "Where is it?" Noah called. "We don't know," Ella answered. The 4 of them dodged trees and hurtled through a web of exposed roots. They splashed through mossy puddles, ducked drooping vines, and plowed through patches of tall grass. Flying insects buzzed past, some pelting their cheeks and brows. Frogs of all sizes leapt out of the way. When they were 20 feet from the curtain, the second Sasquatch jumped out of nowhere to cut them off. Hunched over, it growled, snarled, and spit. The scouts stood braced to run in any direction. Nearby, the tall grass shook and something big hopped out, startling them. Noah looked down to see a frog with a bigger body than a football and back legs almost as long as Noah's arms. Another frog of equal size sprang out of the marshy surroundings, then another and another. Their giant bodies were slick and green. "Richie!" Ella said. "What the heck are these things?" "Goliath frogs, I think." Richie nervously jerked his head left and right. "Biggest frogs in the world." Continuing to leap out, they crowded the space around Noah and his friends, and they began to crawl into another, their dark, bulging eyes fixed forward. As the Sasquatch lowered its head and peered around, drool spilled out from its skull and plotted into a puddle. A frog jumped forward and landed near it. With a grunt, the monster lifted its big foot and tried to squash the frog, which sprang out of the way just in time. Mud and muck sprayed everywhere. When a second frog hopped forward, the Sasquatch tried to kill it, too. A third frog advanced, then a fourth, a fifth. In the air, their long legs dangled webbed feet as large as flat as fly swatters. One frog drove its snout against the monster's leg. Another struck its stomach. One jumped down from a low branch and pushed off to the side. The Sasquatch swung its claws, missing the green aggressors while slicing through low-hanging vines. As more and more frogs attacked, the Sasquatch stepped back, blindly swinging its arms, batting an occasional frog out of the air. It got to within 4 feet of the portal, then 3. Then it tripped over something and fell through the gateway, scores of Goliath frogs pouncing after it. It was gone, and somewhere in the city of species, it was still under attack. "Unbelievable," Richie said as he watched the frogs launch themselves through the portal. Noah took off running back to the way that they had come. "Come on," he said. "We've got to find Tank." Back at the pond, the scouts dropped down and crawled across the path of lily pads. As they went, Noah kept an eye out for the other Sasquatch. There was no sign of it. Noah suspected the tadpoles, the weight of their unimaginable number, had drowned it. At the end of the lily pads, they crawled through the portal and stood up in the grottos. Tank was there, bleeding from a cut above his eye and looking confused. "Tank!" Megan cried out. "You okay?" The big man nodded and forced a deep breath, his body shuddering. "You?" he managed to say. They quickly exchanged stories. The scouts learned that Tank had fought off a Sasquatch in the secret koala castle. When a group of koalas got involved, the Sasquatch fled across the sector. They chased after it, but managed to escape. "I've got to get back to the city of species," Tank said. "Can you guys find your way out of here? Just go back to the northeast and come out through Chinchilla Villa." The scouts nodded. "Go as fast as you can. There might be others down here." He glanced around, seeming to consider something. "This is not good. The Sasquatches, they're moving on the grottos, that's for sure." He struggled to catch his breath and stared at the scouts. "They're coming for your world." Richie gasped and took a step back. Noah felt his heart sink. Without another word, Tank ran through the portal to Koala Castle and was gone. The scouts didn't hesitate. They hurried down the path that would leave the grottos and the seeming increasingly dangerous world of the secret zoo behind. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 15. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and please take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time where we continue the Secret Zoo Riddles in Danger. Take good care, guys.